Okay. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Meet the Expert section. It's a pleasure, a great pleasure for me to introduce today's expert, the Professor Daniela Tumler. Professor Tumler, originally from South Tyrol in northern Italy, completed her study in biological and anthropology and applied science at the Bournemouth University. She conducted significant research internship at the Institution for Mummy Study in Italy and completed her PhD on skeletal remains from the early medieval site of Säben-Sabiona in July 2023. Currently, she teaches at the Burnley College in UK and she working on interdisciplinary research project in archaeological and forensic anthropology. Today's presentation will cover an introduction to forensic anthropology, exploring fatal inter-individual conflict and the population dynamic in the early medieval Italian Alps, and will provide insight in the lives and conflict of individuals from that era with a focus on skeletal trauma analysis. Thank you again for being here, and a special thank you to you, to Professor Tumler, for sharing your expertise with us. Without further ado, the floor is yours, and you can share your presentation.
Thank you. Well, good evening to everyone. So, as Ariana nicely introduced, I will be talking today about forensic and archaeological anthropology. So to begin with, I would just like to provide a bit of an introduction of what this actually is. So anthropology in itself is simply just the study of humans. And we can use anthropology in both forensic as well as archaeological contexts. In forensic science, anthropology is very useful for highly decomposed human remains, so anything that's beyond the bloating stage, anything that's very fragmented or skeletonized, so especially in those later stages, or if you have like plane crashes, anything like that that has high fragmentation, that's when you would like to have an anthropologist there to help you with the recovery, with the identification. So your forensic anthropologist in that context will help you to estimate the time of death and also aid the identification of an individual. So those are the main areas. They can also give some information on the cause of death, but again, only if there are injuries or anything on the actual bone. Then in archaeology, we also find anthropologists, biological anthropologists working in that field. So by using the same kind of methodology as in forensics, we can gain information about the composition of a population, so how many males, how many females there were, the health status, what kind of diseases did they have, how common were these diseases as well, are they specific to certain sexes, age groups, whatever. So we get quite a lot of information out of those. And then we can also look at cultural practices and social organization and human behavior, simply just by looking at the recovered human remains. Now, in the beginning of any anthropological analysis, so for forensic anthropology in particular, we need to establish forensic relevance. So are the sets of remains that we found, are they even human to begin with? Then if they are human, are they modern or ancient? Because obviously if it's an archaeological skeleton, let's say from the Roman period, from a forensic point of view, we were not really interested in that, so we won't launch a forensic investigation on an archaeological set of remains. Then we'll do the time of death estimation. Again, that's more in forensics. In archaeology, obviously we know it's going to be an ancient set of remains. And then the next step is the minimum number of individuals. So figuring out how many bodies do we actually have. So what is the minimum? We're not looking, we're just looking for the minimum. So how many do we find? And then for each body, so for each skeleton that we find, we'll do a full inventory, meaning we assess the quantity, so how many bones are present, so how complete is the skeleton, and then also the quality, so how well are these bones preserved, because obviously if we have good preservation, we will be able to see more things on the surface of the bone, whereas if the preservation is very bad, we will get little information out of this individual. And then we'll also do a photographic documentation. So it's always filling out a recording sheet, as well as always taking photographs of the remains whilst they're in situ, as well as then later on in the lab, to make sure that we've got consistency as well in the data that we collect. And we can show, obviously, injuries and lesions and what we are trying to argue. Then, once we've done the preliminary analysis, we start to look at something called an osteobiography. And an osteobiography is essentially just a reconstruction of a skeleton's life or of a person's life based on their skeleton. So we're literally just using the set of remains that we've got in front of us to establish once a biological profile and then also the pathological profile. So these two profiles will help us then to get information about the demography of the set of remains, so male, female, age, all of these sort of things. We'll get information about diet as well, health, occupation, any injuries and cultural practices, as well as daily activities, mobility, exposure to different environmental factors. So we get quite a lot of stuff out of an individual if we look at an osteobiography. So it's basically just a reconstruction of their life from the skeleton. Now, the biological profile as just contains just basic information, which should be more or less consistent for all sets of skeletal remains. So it includes sex estimation, age at death, as well as ancestry, stature, and then other physical characteristics. So we can look into the body frame index, so the robusticity of the skeleton, so how robust, how much muscle mass did our individual have. Did we have any anatomical variance? So some individuals might have some extra bones, or certain bones might not be fused. So anything like that would be included in the biological profile. And we use anthroposcopic, so visual assessment. So we look at the skeleton and then say, right, it looks more like that, or it looks more like that. And then we also do anthropometric measures, so basically measurements of the bone. So we measure long bones, for instance, to get a stature, to be able to estimate the stature of the body. And so as mentioned, we look at pelvic morphology and cranial traits, so anything in the skull mostly for sex, age, and ancestry estimation, but then we also look at the long bones. So these are the three areas that are most often used to create a biological profile of an individual. And then once we've done that, we'll look at the pathological profile, which looks more at injuries, at diseases, and any other pathological conditions that an individual might have. So all of these lesions can obviously help us to identify a body. So some injuries or some conditions that an individual has might be more suitable than others. So for instance, if we have a very rare disease, like a congenital condition, not many people have it. So if we have a skeleton with such an injury, such a lesion, then we're more likely to identify them if we have obviously the information ready to compare it with it. Whereas if it's, let's say, osteoarthritis, joint degeneration, everyone gets that at a certain age. So by 40, everyone should have some level of osteoarthrosis, some people more than others, but that's a very general condition. So that obviously in a forensic context wouldn't be as useful. However, for archaeology, we can find out about activity patterns as well. So as we look at these diseases, we find information out about occupational stress, lifestyle patterns. Then some of the dental conditions can give us some information about diet as well, and how the oral microbiome may have been composed of. So it gives us quite a lot of information, and especially also with the trauma aspect, we can use that to reconstruct what has happened to individual, if it's peri-mortem trauma, so injuries that happened around the time of death, but also injuries that happened before the time of death. And if we have a case, anything to do with child abuse, for instance, and there is a child that has passed away. Now, if this child displays multiple ante-mortem injuries at different healing stages, we can say, look, there have been multiple injuries at different times. And then, well, there is a strong indication that this individual has been exposed to severe forms of violence over several periods, because otherwise, if it was all happening, I don't know, one accident, then all of these injuries would be at the same stage of healing, for instance. Now, how we use this data, so as I mentioned already partially, so for the preliminary analysis, it is the minimum number of individuals. So especially if you have in an archaeological context, like a mass grave or anything like that, you would want to know how many bodies are in that grave. Have one body in there or 20 makes a substantial difference. Then for forensics especially, we also have the post-mortem interval estimation. So how long has the body been there for, which is also very useful. So obviously in the earlier stages of decomposition, we will have a forensic pathologist doing that. But then as we go over to multiple weeks and months, you would want the forensic anthropologist there to be able to tell you, right, how old do you reckon are these set of remains? Can we pin that down to an individual that has gone missing for a certain period of time? So does that match with who we think it is? And then obviously establishing forensic significance. So that's where these preliminary analyses are useful. Then the biological profile as well as the pathological profile gives us information about, so it helps us to identify the individual. It gives us information about the health status, dietary habits, activity patterns, also potentially information about certain conditions, like I mentioned, congenital conditions. So those are things, conditions that you are born with. And most of these, obviously, they run in the family. So if you've got multiple people with the same congenital condition, an example would be cervical ribs. So some people have got extra ribs on their neck. That's a very rare thing. Not everyone has that. So if you have a set of skeletons who have that, there is a chance that they might be related. Then it also gives us information about the body form and the structure and the body height. So all of these are key elements or key pieces of information that we will need if we want to identify someone. Okay, so it's all information that adds up that we can use to help us. Now, for the rest of the session, I would just like to present two case studies or two pieces of research that I've conducted as part of my PhD. Both of these will be focusing on trauma. So the first one talks more about the trauma patterns and injury prevalence. So it's a bit more of a population sort of level view. And obviously that would be then in an instance where you have, let's say, a mass grave or anything like that, that kind of information would probably be useful. Obviously, it's not a mass grave. This site is something completely different, but I will kind of jump back and sort of try and sort of link it to forensics and to maybe a bit more modern sort of context of how both the archaeological and the forensic sort of aspect interlink here. Now, to begin with, I would just like to give a bit of some background information. So South Tyrol is an autonomous province in northern Italy. So before the First World War, this area used to belong to Austria. And currently, the majority of the population is German-speaking. From a lifestyle and cultural point of view, they're more similar to the Austrian ways of living, but also incorporated quite a lot of Italian elements. So we've got a bit of a mix of cultures there. And this mix of cultures is actually nothing new, because also already during previous periods, because we find ourselves in the Alps, this area was obviously a very important route, travel route, migration route between northern Italy, in Italy and north of Europe in general. So in the early medieval period, so we know that there is quite a lot has been going on, but we don't quite know what has been going on. So from historical sources, we only know that the time period, so the early medieval period, was very, very chaotic. So we've got, as shown here on the map, a couple of dates and a couple of populations that have been moving into this area. And we can see from an archaeological point of view that the whole area shows an increased establishment of hilltop settlements, as well as fortifications and border inspection posts. So all of these, so after the fall of the Roman Empire, so after the 3rd century AD, that's when this starts to happen more and more. So we can tell that there are things happening, people try and keep themselves safe, so there is a change somewhere. And especially from the 6th to 8th century, we know that there are large-scale political changes. But unfortunately, we do not exactly know what has been happening and what has been going on with the people there. So we can see these changes from an archaeological point of view, and we know from historical point of views that there is a lot of stuff going on, but we have no idea about how these people, what was going on with the people that lived there at the time. Were they impacted? Were there wars? How was their health? How was their social structure? Did it have an impact on that? And that's essentially what my PhD was about. To find out a bit more about that, I looked at this site called Säben-Sabiona. So it's located on a mount in the Isaac-Isarco Valley, and this is regarded as the largest early medieval site in this region. It's also the first and only episcopal see of the area, meaning the whole Christianization of this area and the Central Alps has been directed and coordinated from this site as well. And from an archaeological point of view, we know that this site has been infrequently but inhabited since the 3rd to 4th centuries AD. So we've got a frequent occupation of this burial mound. Now, from a sample point of view, so there were 197 graves excavated at the time, but as only 185 were available, those were the only ones that I could study. And in terms of the methodology, it was just standard anthropological methods that are used to establish the biological and paleopathological profile. So obviously I've done what I mentioned before, a biological and paleopathological profile for every single individual. And then using all of this data together, you can then do further population into too much detail on all the extra population analysis, because we'll just focus on the trauma aspect here. But if anyone is interested, I've got a QR code at the end with my thesis on there. So feel free to obviously have a look if anyone is really interested in the whole study of that. Now, one important bit about Säben-Sabiona is that also, so here we also have to think about the archaeology point of view. So in forensic anthropology, we always closely work also with the forensic archaeologist. And this is especially well shown in my PhD work, because from there, I'm looking at the burial practices, so burial location, as well as the presence of grave goods. I was able to formulate, okay, we might have a population that has been selected. So the people that were buried there were chosen to be buried there. Okay. So there are some indicators of high social status, okay, and that's coming purely from an archaeological point of view. So if you are of elevated social status, you can choose where you're being buried. Being buried inside a church or having a crypt or anything like a mausoleum, anything like that shows that you are wealthy, okay? Normal people, poor people cannot afford that. And most of the poor people are usually being buried outside the church because it's cheaper or whatever. So based on that classification, I subdivided. I was able to subdivide the sample into an elite and a non-elite group. And I did most of my analysis looking at those two groups to see whether there are actually some social differences as well between the two. So as I'm going along, I will mention elite and non-elite individuals. Now, as I mentioned earlier about the preliminary analysis, so again, also in archaeology, you do those. So minimum number of individuals. So just because we have 185 graves does not mean that we have 185 bodies. In fact, there were 226 bodies in those graves. So some of these were also crypts. So burial chambers where multiple individuals were put in. Okay, so also, for instance, in a forensic and in a modern context, if we have a mass grave, again, that's when that kind of information becomes useful. How many bodies are we actually dealing with? Then the next thing I had to do was obviously look at the qualitative and quantitative preservation. So how well is my skeletal sample preserved? How much do I have? Because that will then also have an effect, especially if I look at population data on when I'm calculating the disease, how many individuals have diseases, how many bones are affected, and so on. So this is one of the key things that we need to do. And then I also looked at, right, the social status, as I mentioned before. Did burial location and the presence of grave goods, did that have an effect on the preservation of my skeletons? Because again, that could help us in the long run as well with the preservation. So especially if we look at it from a forensic point of view, if we have certain conditions, it will speed up or it will slow down decomposition. Okay, so also with bones, if we have an individual that is buried with iron can stain bones to become red. So that does not mean that somebody has been stabbed and there is blood that has been leaking on the bone. No, they may have just been buried with an iron object. Copper, for instance, if you bury, like copper tends to stain bone in like a greenish coloration. So it's really important that we look into all of that so that we don't misinterpret things afterwards. And then, as I mentioned earlier about the elite and non-elite individuals, so there were 133 individuals who were classed as elite because they were buried inside or had rich grave goods or were buried in a burial chamber, and 93 were classed as non-elite because they didn't have any grave goods or very poor ones and were buried outside. Now, quickly to the demography. So that's just the composition of the burial population. So as you can see here, anything in blue, those are males, anything in red are females, and anything in gray are non-determinable individuals, so where sex was not determined. Also, anything that's, so children, we usually don't tend to estimate sex of children, especially because it gets very difficult from an osteological point of view. So there are some methods that we can use, but it's most of the time we do use DNA analysis over osteological assessment for that. So as we can see from that, there is clearly an imbalance there between the sexes. So we've got too many men and not enough women. So if this, for instance, was a natural population, a normal cemetery of a village, you would expect more females than males, because obviously females can only have one egg a month, okay? So their reproduction is limited to that one egg a month, okay? So you will need to have more females than males in order for a population to be viable. Now, in this case, we've got the opposite, which indicates that there is some sort of issue going on. So this must have been either that the whole area has not been excavated yet, so we're missing some individuals, that only males were buried there, females were buried somewhere else, but there is something that is not right with this population. Now, obviously that's going on for this population here. In a forensic context, again, if we have burials that only contain males or that only contain certain age groups, okay, so that can help us to give us a bit more information about, right, what has been happening? Does all of this match? So for instance, if somebody talks about that it was, I don't know, as part of a war crime, okay, everyone was killed, then if everyone was killed in a village, you would expect a very natural composition of a demographic composition in that mass grave. However, if you only have males or if you only have females, well, then this does not add up unless there is a reason why there should only be males or only children or only females in that specific village or whatever context we have. Okay, so here again, your anthropology becomes very important. And also, anthropology is a very cheap science, for instance, not in the sense that it's easy to do. You need quite a lot of training, but if you have to perform a DNA analysis on each of those individuals, it will get quickly very expensive. And also, if you think about having to do, if you've got mass fatality incidents like plane crashes and that, where you've got loads and loads of bone fragments, if you had to do a DNA analysis, take a DNA sample from all of those, first of all, you won't have anything left of the body. And secondly, it's just going to cost you a lot, whereas as an anthropologist, you would be able to get more information out of it and then afterwards send it on to a DNA analysis if need be. Right, so let's get to our trauma section. So the injury rate of the Säben-Sabiona sample, so there were 16% of the whole population, so 16% of the 226 individuals had some sort of injury. Okay, again, much more males than females, which kind of makes sense because males tend to have more injuries in most populations. So males were more often affected than females or non-determinable adults or also subadults. And as I've said before about the elite and non-elite individuals, so the elite sample had a bit more trauma than the non-elite sample. Okay, so in the elite individuals, it was 20% and the non-elite only 10%. Now, when we look at the total sort of distribution of the trauma, and we can see that the axial skeleton, so the middle part of your body essentially, had the most trauma, followed by your appendicular skeleton, so your arms and your legs, and the craniofacial, so your face and your head essentially had the lowest rate of injuries. Now, if we divide that up into elite and non-elite individuals, the pattern all of a sudden changes. So the elite individuals had an equal distribution of injuries across the whole body. And in the non-elite sample, they had mostly injuries on their arms and on their torso, but not so many on their head. And now that becomes then very interesting when we try and figure out what has been going on with these individuals. What were they actually doing? How did they get these injuries? Okay. Now, from that point of view, I then also had a look at, right, let's look at the timing of the injury. So how old are these? Do they show any signs of healing? And what's the type of injury? What do we have? What has happened? Now, antemortem injuries, so those are the ones that have healed. And perimortem injuries, those are the ones that are fresh, essentially, or have happened around the time of death. So when the body has not had time to heal yet, essentially. So they were found them in similar proportions in elite and non-elite individuals. So there was not much there from that point of view. But then looking at the trauma type, sharp force injuries, so cut marks, were much more prevalent in the elite sample than in the non-elite sample. And the non-elite individuals, they had more fractures and blunt force injuries. Now, I'll be getting back to that later on when we talk about the interpretation of that, what all of that means. But before, I would just like to dig a bit more into the whole trauma analysis bit. So if I then look also at the trauma pattern on an individual basis, So regardless of elite and non-elite individuals now. So most individuals had antemortem injuries. So we had much more healed fractures overall that were caused by blunt force trauma. And then and then all the other ones were perimortem sharp force trauma. Okay, so those were the most common ones. Now, the individuals that had blunt force injuries had mostly fractures of the long bones, and a few had some cranial injuries. Okay, and about 30 of the analyzed skeletons had 49 of all the lesions. Okay, so that means, if we work that out, that each of those individuals had less than 5 injuries per body. And then the remaining 7 individuals had 92 injuries, meaning each of those had between 7 and 29 lesions. Okay, now if we then look a bit more into those individuals with multiple injuries, so those 7 bodies had more perimortem injuries than antemortem injuries, so they had much more of those injuries that happened around the time of death. Okay, then also, as we can see here, the distribution of those as well. Now, the individuals with multiple injuries, they also had mainly sharp force trauma, so cut wounds. They had a couple of blunt force injuries as well, but they were not as common as the sharp force injuries. And we had one individual, SK63, so I will be talking about this individuals in a bit in more detail, had the most injuries. Then we had individuals 228, which had 16 injuries. Individuals 114 had 14 injuries, and so on. So with SK 126, only 6 lesions, but again, 6 lesions are also very high. Then what does that mean from an overall point of view? So I've not talked too much in here also about the disease pattern, but that is a bit more in detail also in my thesis, which all adds up to what has been found from a trauma point of view. So most of the individuals, as I mentioned before, had antemortem injuries, and only maybe up to 5. Now we know that people who live in those areas, so even nowadays, people work in alpine, in very steep environments. Now, working in a dangerous environment, working with animals, these are very high injury risks. Okay. Also, working in forests, so forestry has also got a very high injury risk. So most of those, also the location of those lesions, as we said, in the axial skeleton, in the chest and in the arms, those are areas that are often injured. So most of these lesions are probably associated with manual labor and just normal accidents. However, those 7 individuals that had multiple lesions, and most of them were sharp force injuries, only those can be associated with some sort of interpersonal conflict. Okay, so what type of conflict then? Because obviously I know now, right, that most of them are probably just involved in some accidents, but I want to know what's been going on with those that have been fighting. What kind of fights were they involved in? Now, there are a couple of things that would match to those. So from a historical point of view, we do not have any evidence of larger battles or larger wars. Okay, there are some indications of raids, executions, assassinations, single combat. And that's also what we can see on these skeletons. Okay, so most of those injuries that are found on there are probably associated with small scale violence, so nothing large scale, and if anything, at the most raids. Okay, and now moving on from a bit more information now about this SK63, so the individual that had the highest injury rate. So let's just have a quick chat about that one. So That body, so just to give a bit of archaeological context, it was a single grave. It was in complete articulation, so the body was fully there, preserved. It was buried in Christian tradition, so typical Christian tradition, with being also west-east orientated. Then the hands and the arms and the legs extended, hands across, crossed over the pelvis. And this individual had a wooden a comb as a grave good. Okay, so it didn't have anything rich, but it had that grave good there. So it's more of a, can be classed as also an elite individual because it's inside the church, so in the side apsis, as we can see on the top picture there. Now, based on the grave goods, this individual can be dated based on relative dating to the 7th and the 8th century. And my aim was to find out, right, what has happened to this person. So what weapons were used? What were the dynamics? So was it small scale, large scale? What's been going on? So again, I'm not going to go into detail again about the methods and everything, as we mentioned that before. So the traditional stuff that we use was used for this case study. So I'm going to start directly with the results. So from a preservation point of view, again, here preservation is very important. So it was very well preserved from a quantitative point of view and also qualitative point of view. If the body was very poorly preserved, again, 29 injuries, there could have been more, and we don't know because of the preservation. So here it was also very important in order to be able to count how many injuries we have and to be able to see them, that we include the preservation of the remains. Then from a biological point of view, we have a 19 to 25-year-old male, so a very young male individual, and he had 29 injuries. 3 of those were antemortem, so they showed signs of healing, whereas 26 of those were perimortem injuries. So they happened around the time of death. Okay. And all of the perimortem injuries, so all of those ones that happened around the time of death, were sharp force trauma. So they were cut marks. Now, as we look at the distribution, so where these injuries are, so we have quite a few of them in the thorax and the spine. Okay, and especially in the left spine. So as we can see here from this graph, most injuries are on the left-hand side of the body. So we've got loads on the thorax and the spine on the left side. So thorax, so meaning the left ribs essentially. Then the upper limb and the shoulder girdle, again, mostly on the left side. In the face, so cranium and mandible, some on the right, bit more on the right than on the left for that one. And then also we've also got injuries on the lower limbs and the pelvic girdle. So I'm going to go through most of these injuries now. So we've got a few nice pictures as well for you to be able to see where these injuries are, how they look like, and how extreme some of those were as well. Because obviously it takes quite a lot of force to be able to dismember something, and especially cutting through bone. Now let's start with the face. So on the illustration here, we can see, so the illustration here at the top shows the right zygomatic, and then we've got in the middle the maxilla, and all the way on the right hand side you've got an illustration, arrows to show where these injuries were inflicted. Now, for this injury here, for the maxilla, the lower part, so the bottom bit, that is essentially, it's a tooth. So the frontal incisor, okay, the left one here has been completely torn off, okay, so it's been cut through. So being able to cut through a tooth, you need quite a lot of force to be able to do that, okay. Cutting through soft tissue is a different story than cutting through bone, essentially. Quite a few, 3 lesions right across the face. One down here, one down over here, and one that goes across here. Now moving on to your rib cage. So these are the first and the second left rib. So these ones are obviously located up here. So as you can feel here, you've got your clavicle, and right underneath your clavicle, so right underneath there, you've got your first rib, and then right underneath, you've got your second rib. Now, as you can see here, the first and the second rib, they've got a little nick on either side. So they've got a little injury there. Now, when you put them together next to each other, it seems like there must have been something that's gone down between the two. Now, if we look at the anatomy side of things, there are quite a few big blood vessels that go past. Obviously, depending on the position of the arm, cutting into there will do severe damage, okay? Lethal damage, essentially. Then also on the left hand, so we've got the fourth proximal phalanx and the fifth metacarpal. So you can see here again on the illustration on the right hand side to where these bones are located and how these lesions, what has happened here. So as it is on the left hand side, when you essentially what it is with the fence injury, so they tend to be on the hands. So hands are very good indications for defense injury. So we've got the left hand, the fourth proximal phalanx and the fifth metacarpal, or those two have been injured. So it could be anything that our individual here was grabbing a blade, or it was just torn off, but it must have been sort of in a bent position to get that kind of injury there. And moving further down to the body, we've got the right os coxem, so that's your right pelvis bone, okay? Again, so that's a clear cut into the bone. Again, we've got very big blood vessels next to it. Again, because it was, because of this angle, we cannot quite say, right, did it hit those blood vessels or not? But it's quite a deep injury into the abdominal region, okay? So again, we cannot see anything from a soft tissue perspective. That's one of the issues, obviously, with looking at archaeological remains or anything that is highly decomposed already, but that's just how it is. But the fact that we have an injury there allows us to reconstruct, right, these are the other structures that are nearby. Could these have been injured? Yes or no? Is this a lethal injury or not? Then moving now further down to the right femur. So we've got here a lesion that is right across the femur. So there is a lot of muscle mass on your thigh bone. And so it may have not been lethal because most of the blood vessels go down on the internal side, so in the medial side of your leg, but it was definitely bleeding quite a bit, that sort of injury, and it has done quite a bit of damage. Then we also have an injury on the left. There are two injuries there, one on the femoral neck. So the femoral neck is right by the pelvis there, so as you can see. Now, to get a cut wound right by the femoral neck, you will need to be sort of either in a bending position, or you need to rotate your leg laterally in order to be able to get there, okay? So either in a squatting position or having your leg a bit out to be able to reach that area. So that's one lesion here at the neck. And then the other lesion is on the surface of the femur, so on the frontal sort of mid-diaphysis. Now, what is very interesting with that one, if we have a closer look through the image, we can see these striations, so these lines. Then we can also see that there is one area of that lesion that is very smooth and very sharp, whereas the top here, as you can see, it's almost like it's broken off. And that gives us quite a lot of information, actually. So first of all, these striations, if we had the weapon that has caused that, so if we had multiple weapons, we could compare the nicks or the damages on the sword, or on, well, in this case, it was probably a sword, with this lesion, because obviously you can only get a pattern from a sword that had that was damaged, and that's why it's causing this lesion on the bone. Then what it also tells us is that the blade ran from the inside, so from the inside of your leg towards the outside for the bone to chip away externally. Okay, so it also gives us information in from what direction the injury was inflicted. Now, concluding all of that, so bringing all of this together, so we had these 26 perimortem injuries, 4 on the cranium, 22 on the postcranium. Most of them were on the left postcranium or the thorax, and the laterality. So if you have loads of injuries on the left-hand side, that indicates that there has been a right-handed attacker, because most people, when they are right-handed, when you attack someone, you left side, it's the opposite. So it was probably a right-handed attacker, so that's what we can tell. Then I was also able to tell which lesion was caused maybe by a sword, maybe by an axe, maybe by a knife. So we've got at least one attacker. It could be actually more, or maybe 2, but it was definitely like a small sort of conflict. So it was nothing larger. Then it was a combination of face-to-face and direct hand-to-hand conflict. So it could have been 1 or 2 individuals. It could have been also a little raid or anything on a smaller scale, though, that has inflicted these injuries to that body. Now, the lesions on the ribs, they're consistent with stab wounds, so a short-bladed weapon, so such a knife. And the os coxa and the femur, so those are more like a sword type weapon, so something larger has been used to inflict those injuries. So all of that, if this was a modern case, will give us quite a lot of information to what has happened to this individual. Okay, and this is why anthropology is also so useful, whether it be in a forensic or in an archaeological context. It gives us quite a lot of information. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. Here are the promised QR codes with the links to the publications if anyone is interested. And well, if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you so much, Professor Tumler, for your fascinating
Welcome.
and insightful presentation. I believe your presentation has been particularly clear and valuable for our student, our audience, to giving them an idea of a real-world application of anthropology and forensic anthropology. I invite our audience to ask any question in the box Q&A in chat, if you have any question for the professor. In the meantime, I would like to ask you a question to help our student further understand this field. I know that the field of forensic anthropology and for anthropology is very broad, and we could take an hour to speak about this. However, could you share what you find the most interesting and rewarding about your work?
To be honest, it's a difficult question because I've got loads of interests, so narrowing that down is very difficult. No, but I'm really interested in trauma, injuries, and the dynamics of that. And also, I did a lot on activity reconstruction. So as I mentioned, I haven't talked too much about it in that because we obviously focused on trauma. But as part of my PhD, I also looked at muscle attachment sites and the rates of osteoarthrosis in the different joints, and combined together with the injuries really enabled me to get like a really good picture or representation of what these individuals were actually doing, and then being able to combine that with historical information, with archaeological information, with current anthropological studies like on modern populations. It's just really fascinating how all the different pieces come together. And I would say, aside from archaeology, but also in forensics, working with different disciplines and different people just allows you to be part, not only be part of a team, but add a piece to the puzzle to sort of get a better picture of what's been going on. And I think that's the most rewarding part of anthropology, just being able to add something and to give something back to society.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
I
no.
don't listen.
Yes,
Yes, the line go down one moment. Thank you, Daniel. So we have a question in our box. One, I read the message. Thank you for the informative presentation, Dr. Tumler. I'm interested in what is a future research subject you would love to explore within your field.
So there are again a couple. So it's not just one. But in particular, so the area that I've studied has not been studied at all. So my research, as well as my PhD, is currently the most extensive anthropological research from this area. So I definitely want to continue my research on local populations and find out more, essentially also about my own history and the people that live there, but then also focus on developing current methodology. Because one big issue that we have in anthropology is that we use the same methods. Some of these methods have been developed on different populations. Now we know in every area of the world we have different people. So we do have variation, quite a lot of variation, in fact. Now, how accurate is a method that has been developed on, let's say, modern American white Caucasian men? How accurate is that for, I don't know, an Italian population, an Alpine population, a population from Central Africa, for instance? Okay, so there we use those methods because there's nothing else available. There's a lot of research going into that and sort of method testing and all of that. But yes, that's definitely something that I personally would like to work on as well, to really test, like, what are we using? Is this actually accurate? Is it actually giving us what we want to get, or do we produce wrong data, essentially? Because it's not, it could be more accurate, but there isn't enough research yet on it.
Thank you. I think that your answer is very clear. So someone have another question? No? No one. Okay. If there are no further questions, since our time is over, I would say we can conclude this interesting meeting. I thank you all again for listening, and a special thank you to you, Professor Tumler, for sharing your expertise and your knowledge with all us this evening in a very clear way. I invite all our audience to stay updated on our platform to follow the next Meet the Expert session. And if you are interested in learn more about this interesting field, you can enroll in our Master of Science in Forensic Biology, where there are different subjects, like also forensic anthropology, which will be covered more in detail in the master. Thank you again to all, and have a nice evening. Bye.
Right.
Thank you.